In the world of global politics, relationships between nations are often celebrated as if they are built on steel and stone, unshakable and enduring. Leaders speak about strategic partnerships, unbreakable alliances, and eternal friendships, but beneath those words lies a much more delicate reality. The truth is that international relations are not fortified walls, they are fragile bridges. These bridges are held together by threads of trust, mutual respect, careful diplomacy, and a recognition of shared values. When nurtured, they grow stronger over time. When neglected or mishandled, they can crumble with surprising speed. Nowhere is this fragility more visible than in the story of how one reckless act by a single individual can jeopardize decades of cooperation between two powerful nations like the United States and India. The US-India partnership has been hailed as one of the defining relationships of the 21st century. Built on shared democratic ideals, the common desire for economic growth, and a joint vision of security in a turbulent world, it is a relationship that has weathered differences and disagreements. Yet, like a carefully built house of cards, even the strongest alliance can collapse if one piece is pulled out too quickly or carelessly. What many forget is that despite the size and power of nations, their interactions are deeply human. Behind every handshake, treaty, or agreement are people, leaders, diplomats, business figures, or ordinary citizens whose choices can strengthen or weaken the entire structure. This is where fragility becomes most apparent. Imagine two nations with decades of progress behind them. Trade agreements have been signed, cultural exchanges celebrated, and defense partnerships carefully structured. Leaders of both countries speak about their natural alliance. Citizens of both nations begin to see each other as partners in a global mission. Yet in the midst of this growing closeness, one act of arrogance or dishonesty can unravel it all. A diplomat who disrespects protocol, a leader who uses careless words, a businessman whose corruption scandal implicates both governments. Any of these can send shockwaves through the relationship. Because in diplomacy, perception matters as much as reality. A single insult, a single betrayal, a single crime can eclipse years of goodwill. The fragility of international relations lies in this truth. Progress is not linear, and it does not take equal force to destroy what has been built. It may take years of negotiations, countless meetings, and tireless diplomatic effort to reach a milestone of cooperation. But just one incident can undo that progress overnight. What makes this fragility even more striking is that once trust is shaken, nations rarely return to the exact same level of openness they once had. Suspicion lingers, doubt becomes part of the equation. Leaders who once spoke of partnership now calculate risks with more caution, fearing another betrayal. The bridge, even if repaired, never looks the same again. This is why the actions of one individual can have such devastating consequences. It is not only about what they do, but about what that act symbolizes. When one person insults or betrays another nation, it is not seen as a personal mistake. It is interpreted as a reflection of the entire country's attitude. A thoughtless remark by a politician can be seen as a government stance. A careless move by a diplomat can be treated as national arrogance. A corrupt businessman's dealings can create an image of systemic dishonesty. Whether fair or not, the symbolic weight of individual actions makes international relations vulnerable. History is filled with moments where fragile relations broke down because of individuals. Sometimes it was a leader who let pride dictate policy instead of reason. Sometimes it was a diplomat who failed to handle a crisis with tact. Sometimes it was even ordinary citizens whose actions in foreign lands sparked outrage and retaliation. These examples teach us that nations, for all their size and power, are not immune to the smallest cracks. And when the alliance in question is between two rising powers like the United States and India, the stakes are higher than ever. Another element of fragility comes from the role of public perception. In today's world where news spreads instantly across media platforms, an isolated event does not remain isolated for long. A dispute involving one person quickly becomes front-page headlines. Television debates magnify it. Social media inflames it. And soon the people of both nations feel personally offended or betrayed. Leaders under pressure from public outrage are forced to take harder stances. What might have been solved quietly through diplomacy escalates into a crisis that seems insurmountable. Fragility, therefore, is not just about the action itself, but about the way the action is amplified and interpreted by millions. Consider how carefully nations must tread around each other. One wrong word in a joint press conference can lead to diplomatic notes of protest. One unfulfilled trade promise can spark accusations of bad faith. One military incident on the border of another ally can pull two countries into a war of words. These things happen not because nations are inherently weak, but because the relationships between them are inherently fragile. They are living entities that need constant care, attention, and trust. Without that, the smallest disruption can create ripples that grow into storms. The fragility of international relations also highlights the importance of humility and restraint. Leaders and diplomats must recognize that every act carries weight, every decision is symbolic, and every word spoken on the global stage echoes beyond what they can control. When they forget this, they risk becoming the individual who undoes decades of progress. Fragility is not meant to paralyze nations into inaction, but to remind them of their responsibility. It reminds them that power, no matter how great, is never absolute when it comes to maintaining friendships. For the US and India, this fragility has been tested more than once. Disagreements over trade, defense deals, and geopolitical alignments have at times strained their relationship. Yet, both nations have found ways to move forward, aware that their shared future outweighs temporary conflict. Still, the lesson remains clear. The foundation of this partnership is strong only if both sides guard it against the recklessness of individuals. Because even one act of carelessness has the potential to destroy the trust that took generations to build. Fragility, then, is not weakness, it is a warning. It is a reminder that the most powerful alliances are not beyond harm. They require vigilance, humility, and responsibility. And when a single person's actions place that relationship in jeopardy, the world is reminded of just how delicate the bonds of diplomacy really are. Throughout history, it has often been assumed that great nations are only moved by great forces, armies, revolutions, economic crashes, or sweeping political movements. Yet again and again, the evidence has shown that sometimes the course of entire nations and even their relationships with one another can be altered by the decisions or mistakes of just one person. The idea that one individual can shape the destiny of millions may sound exaggerated, but international relations are filled with such moments. The power of one individual to make or break ties between two countries, to ignite hostility or foster cooperation, cannot be underestimated. This truth is most clearly illustrated in how a single Indian, through actions of ambition, arrogance, or carelessness, could bring US-India relations to the brink of collapse. The sheer weight of responsibility on those who represent their country abroad cannot be overstated. A diplomat is not just a man or woman with a title. They embody their nation, their words, their behavior, their respect or lack of respect, all become symbols of their homeland. If they conduct themselves with dignity, their country's dignity is affirmed. If they act in arrogance or insult another nation, it is not seen as a personal failing, but as the stance of the country they represent. This is where the power of one individual becomes so potent. Unlike in domestic matters where a mistake may be contained, on the international stage, it explodes outward, shaping perception and creating ripples of consequence. Consider how fragile trust is between nations. It takes decades of steady work to establish a reputation as a reliable ally. Yet when one person breaks that trust, intentionally or through carelessness, suspicion begins to grow. A diplomat caught in a scandal, a minister making reckless remarks, a business leader accused of fraud, all of these can trigger doubt. That doubt does not remain confined to the individual. It extends outward to question the entire system that allowed such a person to hold power or influence. A single man's corruption may suddenly be seen as a symptom of a corrupt nation. A single woman's mistreatment in foreign service may be interpreted as national arrogance. This is how the mistakes of one individual metastasize into the perception of an entire country. The United States and India, for example, have worked for decades to overcome mistrust from the Cold War era. Slowly, step by step, they built channels of defense cooperation, expanded trade partnerships, and encouraged cultural exchanges. Both sides began to speak of one another as natural allies. Yet in this long journey of building bridges, a single incident involving one Indian, whether a diplomat, politician, or business magnate, could threaten the foundation. If an Indian diplomat mistreated by American authorities reacts in an undiplomatic manner, the story becomes not about that person, but about whether India respects or disrespects American law. If an Indian business tycoon is exposed for fraudulent dealings in America, it becomes a question of whether Indian enterprises can be trusted. In each case, the individual becomes the embodiment of the nation, even though they may not represent the majority. The power of one individual lies also in the symbolism attached to their act. Nations interpret events not merely as isolated incidents, but as signs of intent. If one Indian official openly criticizes American policies in a hostile tone, America may interpret it as India turning its back on partnership. If one Indian military leader makes provocative comments, the US may suspect India's loyalty in strategic alliances. It does not matter whether the broader Indian government agrees or not. The damage is done. One person's words or decisions become fuel for suspicion and conflict. This is the power of the individual in international relations, to turn cooperation into confrontation with a single act. This is not to say that individuals only cause harm. The same truth works in reverse. Sometimes it has been a single person whose vision, restraint, or wisdom has saved alliances from falling apart. A leader choosing to apologize rather than escalate, a diplomat carefully mending a misunderstanding, a business leader ensuring fair dealings. These individual acts too can shape history. Yet the destructive power is often more visible because destruction happens faster than construction. Years of effort can be undone in days, while rebuilding may take decades. This imbalance makes the actions of individuals particularly dangerous in diplomacy. The power of one individual also lies in the way media amplifies their actions. In today's world, a single statement made by a prominent figure spreads instantly across newspapers, television, and social media. A comment that may have been forgotten in another age becomes a permanent mark, replayed again and again. Citizens of both nations absorb the insult or betrayal personally, and suddenly public pressure mounts. Leaders are no longer free to quietly resolve the matter. They must respond boldly to satisfy the anger of their people. Thus, the mistake of one Indian magnified by media coverage becomes a storm threatening the entire US-India relationship. Another dimension of this power comes from the fact that international relations are built not just on interests, but also on perceptions of respect. The United States, being a global superpower, is particularly sensitive to whether its status is acknowledged. India, being a rising power, is equally sensitive about its sovereignty and dignity. In such a climate, one individual's misstep can easily be perceived as disrespect. That disrespect, even if unintentional, can create long-lasting resentment. When respect is questioned, relationships falter because nations are driven not only by strategy but also by pride. Yet the deeper truth here is that the individual's power exists because nations allow it. When someone acts recklessly, they are often elevated by media, condemned by politicians, and discussed endlessly by analysts. Instead of isolating the act to the person, it becomes generalized to the country. This shows how much weight individuals carry when representing their nation. Their mistakes are magnified because the world is quick to associate them with something larger. For this reason, those in positions of responsibility must always remember that they are more than themselves. They are symbols carrying the burden of their nation's honor. Ultimately, the story of how one Indian could damage US-India relations is not just about one person. It is about the truth that nations, however powerful, are vulnerable to the actions of individuals. It is about the reminder that diplomacy is not a machine but a human endeavor, shaped by the choices, temperaments, and failings of people. The power of one individual is therefore both a warning and a lesson. A warning that carelessness can bring destruction, and a lesson that responsibility must be carried with utmost seriousness. Trust is the invisible currency that sustains relationships between nations. Without it, treaties are nothing more than pieces of paper, handshakes are empty gestures, and promises ring hollow. When two countries as significant as the United States and India engage with one another, the foundation of that relationship rests less on the legal frameworks of agreements and more on the perception that both sides are dependable, respectful, and committed to keeping their word. Once that trust is broken, even if only by the actions of a single individual, it is not easily restored. Trust is painstakingly built layer by layer through consistency, honesty, and goodwill, but it can be undone in a matter of moments, leaving both sides suspicious and resentful. The US-India relationship has always been complicated by history, geography, and politics. During the Cold War, India's policy of non-alignment and occasional closeness to the Soviet Union meant that Washington often regarded New Delhi with skepticism. Similarly, many in India viewed the US as an unreliable partner that sided with Pakistan in times of crisis. It took decades of diplomatic effort to begin erasing those suspicions. Economic reforms in India, the rise of globalization, and a recognition of shared democratic values opened new opportunities for cooperation. Leaders on both sides emphasized the importance of partnership in areas like defense, counterterrorism, technology, and climate change. Slowly, trust began to grow where mistrust had once been the norm. Yet, because that trust was so hard-earned, it remained fragile. Every misstep, every misunderstanding, every questionable action by either side carried the risk of reigniting old doubts. When a single individual acts in a way that undermines trust, it becomes more than a personal failure. It casts a shadow over the entire partnership. If, for example, an Indian diplomat were found to be involved in conduct that disrespected US laws, it would not merely be seen as one person's mistake. American policymakers and media might interpret it as evidence that India does not fully respect US institutions. Similarly, if a politician or business leader in India were to insult or deceive American counterparts, that act would be taken as a reflection of India's broader attitude toward the United States. In such cases, the trust carefully built between governments begins to erode, replaced by suspicion and doubt. The difficulty with trust is that it is not a contract, it is an emotional and psychological state. Once someone feels betrayed, no legal agreement can immediately restore the confidence that existed before. In international relations, this is even more pronounced because countries cannot afford to take risks with unreliable partners. If Washington begins to doubt India's dependability, it might hesitate before entering new defense agreements or intelligence sharing arrangements. If New Delhi begins to doubt Washington's sincerity, it may seek alternative alliances that weaken cooperation. The breakdown of trust does not stay confined to one area, it spreads into every aspect of the relationship. Trust also depends on consistency. When leaders change in either country, the first question is always whether the new administration can be trusted to uphold previous commitments. The US-India partnership has been tested during transitions of power in both nations. At times, it has taken months or even years to reassure each other that old promises would still be honored. A single individual's action that betrays trust can therefore undo the careful balance maintained across governments and political parties. It can raise doubts about whether the country itself, not just its leaders, is a trustworthy partner. The importance of trust becomes even clearer when one considers the stakes involved in US-India relations. Defense cooperation requires the sharing of sensitive technologies and intelligence. Economic partnerships involve billions of dollars in investments and trade. Climate agreements demand long-term commitments and sacrifices. None of these can function without trust. If either side begins to suspect that the other might misuse information, back out of agreements, or manipulate terms unfairly, the willingness to cooperate diminishes. A relationship that once seemed full of potential becomes guarded, transactional, and hollow. Another element that makes trust so vital is public perception. Nations are not just negotiating with governments, they are also speaking to each other's citizens. When trust is intact, people in both countries feel optimistic about working together. Students choose to study abroad, businesses expand their investments, and tourists travel freely. But when trust is broken, citizens grow skeptical. They begin to view the other nation not as a friend, but as a potential threat or rival. This shift in perception can create political pressure on leaders to adopt harsher policies, further damaging the relationship. In this way, the trust between governments directly influences the trust between peoples. It is also worth recognizing that trust is not symmetrical. Sometimes one country feels betrayed more strongly than the other. If one Indian's action causes America to doubt India, the US may impose stricter measures or demand apology. India, in turn, may feel humiliated or disrespected by America's response, deepening the rift. The cycle of mistrust feeds on itself. What began as one individual's misstep spirals into a standoff where both nations feel wronged. The longer this cycle continues, the harder it becomes to return to the cooperative spirit that existed before. Rebuilding trust after it is broken is always harder than maintaining it. Apologies may be offered, investigations launched, or symbolic gestures made, but the memory of betrayal lingers. Leaders may forgive, but they rarely forget. They begin to hedge their commitments, calculating the risk of future betrayals. Agreements are made with more conditions and safeguards. The warmth of the relationship cools, replaced by a cautious distance. What was once a friendship begins to resemble a wary coexistence. This is why a single incident, even if seemingly small, can have disproportionate effects on international relations. It damages the emotional foundation upon which all cooperation rests. At its heart, the role of trust in partnerships like that of the United States and India reminds us that diplomacy is not just about power or interests, it is about credibility. Nations want to know that when they extend their hand, the other will not pull away. They want to believe that when they share information or make sacrifices, the other side will not exploit them. Without this belief, even the most advantageous partnership becomes unstable. A single Indian, through carelessness, arrogance, or corruption, has the power to make America question whether India can be trusted. That doubt, once planted, grows quickly and can choke the life out of cooperation. This is why trust is the most valuable and the most vulnerable element in international relations. It is slow to build, fragile to maintain, and easy to destroy. When one person's actions break that trust, it is not just an isolated mistake. It is a rupture that can spread across every area of the relationship. For the United States and India, the lesson is clear. Protect trust at all costs, because without it, the partnership collapses into suspicion, resentment, and lost opportunity. When two nations experience conflict, the severity of the disagreement often depends not only on the issue itself, but on how that issue is portrayed and perceived by the public. In today's interconnected world, the role of media cannot be separated from the fate of international relations. Media no longer serves as a passive observer, but as an active participant that frames events, amplifies narratives, and often accelerates tensions. When it comes to the United States and India, both vibrant democracies with large populations deeply engaged in political discourse, media on both sides has immense power to transform a small diplomatic dispute into a full-blown crisis. What may have been a misunderstanding capable of being solved quietly behind closed doors becomes, through the force of media coverage, a public spectacle demanding strong responses. One of the reasons media plays such a decisive role in US-India relations is the speed at which information now travels. In earlier decades, news about diplomatic disagreements might take days or weeks to reach the public, leaving governments time to negotiate resolutions in private. Now, with 24-hour television channels, online news portals, and social media platforms, every incident is broadcast instantly. If one Indian official says something perceived as disrespectful to the US, within minutes it becomes trending news. Clips circulate across platforms, hashtags emerge, opinion pieces flood in, and the event no longer belongs to the diplomats, but to the public imagination. At that point, even if leaders wish to resolve matters quietly, they find themselves cornered by public opinion shaped by the media narrative. This amplification often strips away nuance. Media thrives on clear heroes and villains, on sharp contrast rather than subtle shades. So, if a crisis occurs, one side is portrayed as the aggressor and the other as the victim. This binary storytelling sells headlines but harms diplomacy, which requires compromise and understanding. For example, if one Indian's action in the United States is reported as an act of national insult, Indian media may paint America as unjust or arrogant. On the other side, US media may frame India as defiant or disrespectful. Both publics consuming these polarized narratives begin to see the other country not as a partner but as an adversary. Leaders aware of this shift in sentiment feel compelled to adopt harsher tones, reinforcing the divide rather than bridging it. Social media intensifies this problem further. Unlike traditional media, which has editorial checks and balances, platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram allow anyone to shape the narrative. Anger spreads faster than reason. Outrage travels farther than context. A small clip taken out of context can ignite nationwide protests or diplomatic uproar. Troll armies, political influencers, and opportunistic commentators exploit these moments to push their own agendas, ensuring that what might have remained a minor issue becomes a matter of national pride or humiliation. In both the United States and India, where citizens hold strong national identities, social media outrage quickly transforms into pressure on governments to act decisively. This pressure often eliminates the space for quiet diplomacy. A government that might have preferred to resolve a dispute with calm and discretion suddenly finds its hands tied. The public, inflamed by media coverage, demands visible retaliation, be it summoning ambassadors, suspending trade talks, or issuing fiery statements. Leaders, fearing accusations of weakness, take actions they may privately regret. Thus, the media does not simply report the conflict, it drives its escalation. A cycle begins where each government escalates to appease domestic audiences while the underlying issue that sparked the disagreement remains unresolved. The media also creates lasting images that define relationships beyond the immediate crisis. Single incident repeated endlessly across television screens and digital platforms becomes etched in collective memory. Citizens may not remember the context or resolution, but they remember the narrative. If an Indian diplomat is humiliated in America and that image circulates endlessly, Indians will remember it as a symbol of disrespect, regardless of the eventual outcome. If an Indian businessman cheats American investors and that story dominates headlines, Americans will carry the perception of Indian corruption long after the case is settled. These images linger, shaping how people view the other country in the long term. The interplay of media and politics also means that individuals who make mistakes are rarely seen in isolation. Instead, they become symbols for broader criticisms. If one Indian offends American sentiment, media coverage in the U.S. may not stop at criticizing the individual. It may generalize to question Indian governance, Indian culture, or Indian intentions. Indian media in turn may retaliate by pointing to American hypocrisy or arrogance. This back and forth inflames tensions at a societal level, turning what began as one person's misstep into a perceived clash of civilizations or values. At the same time, media can serve as a tool of manipulation. Political figures in both countries understand the influence of headlines and may use media outrage to strengthen their own positions. A leader facing domestic challenges may exaggerate an external conflict to rally nationalist support. By framing another country as disrespectful, leaders distract citizens from internal issues. This exploitation of media narratives makes it even harder for rational voices to prevail as compromise becomes politically costly. No leader wants to be seen by their media as weak, so they play into the cycle of confrontation. Despite these challenges, it is important to note that media is not always destructive. At times, it has helped to ease tensions by highlighting cooperation, celebrating shared values, and giving space to stories of friendship between Americans and Indians. Coverage of Indian students succeeding in the U.S., cultural exchanges, or joint military exercises creates goodwill and strengthens the sense of partnership. However, the problem is that negative stories, particularly those involving conflict or scandal, receive far more attention. They overshadow the positive, shaping the perception of the relationship primarily through crises rather than achievements. The role of media, therefore, is double-edged. It is a force that can bring nations closer together by telling stories of partnership, but it is also a force that can drive them apart by exaggerating differences. When one Indian's actions spark controversy, the way the media frames the event can be more damaging than the act itself. If reported with balance, the issue may be contained and resolved. If sensationalized, it can become a wedge dividing two great democracies. The fate of U.S.-India relations in moments of crisis thus depends not only on the wisdom of leaders, but also on the responsibility of those who shape narratives for millions. This reality underscores the need for restraint and responsibility in media reporting. The press in both countries holds immense power, and with that power comes accountability. The choice to amplify outrage or to encourage dialogue determines whether conflicts spiral or subside. Yet in a competitive media landscape driven by ratings, outrage often wins. The unfortunate result is that the actions of one Indian magnified beyond proportion can become the seed of distrust between entire nations. In the end, the media does not create the initial act, but it defines its significance. It transforms personal mistakes into national insults, minor disputes into global headlines, and diplomatic misunderstandings into crises of pride. This is why, when reflecting on how U.S.-India relations have been endangered by a single individual, one must also recognize that the individual alone is rarely the full story. It is the media's amplification, the creation of heroes and villains, and the fueling of public outrage that turn one person's act into a threat to an entire partnership. The media does not just tell the story of international relations, it writes it in real time, shaping the emotions of nations and steering the course of their destiny. Accountability has always been the cornerstone of leadership, governance, and diplomacy. Without accountability, power becomes reckless, authority becomes dangerous, and relationships become unstable. In the realm of international relations, where every action carries immense symbolic weight, accountability is not merely a moral expectation but a necessity for survival. The actions of one individual can jeopardize an entire nation's reputation, and in such moments, accountability serves as both a shield and a corrective force. It reminds the world that no individual, however powerful, stands above the values of responsibility, honesty, and justice. When discussing how one Indian might have placed U.S.-India relations in jeopardy, the lesson that emerges is not simply about failure, but about accountability, about whether the mistake was acknowledged, corrected, and prevented from recurring. Accountability begins with the recognition that those who represent their country carry far more than personal identity. A diplomat in Washington, a politician addressing foreign audiences, a business tycoon negotiating trade deals, each of them is more than themselves. They are symbols of their nation. Their success or failure is interpreted not only as a reflection of their character, but as an extension of the country's values. When such an individual acts recklessly, arrogantly, or dishonestly, the harm inflicted extends beyond their personal reputation. It spills over into the nation they represent. Accountability, therefore, demands that when mistakes occur, the individual is not shielded under the cover of patriotism, but is held to a standard that assures the world that justice and responsibility matter. The difficulty in practicing accountability is that nations often fall into the trap of defensiveness. When one of their own is accused of wrongdoing abroad, the instinct is to protect them in the name of national pride. Governments sometimes treat criticism of individuals as criticism of the entire nation, and instead of addressing the wrong, they escalate the conflict. This defensive posture may satisfy domestic audiences temporarily, but it corrodes international trust. For example, if an Indian official acted improperly in the United States and India refused to acknowledge it, choosing instead to deflect blame onto American authorities, accountability would be abandoned. The result would not only worsen the diplomatic crisis, but also make the United States question whether India as a whole respects global norms. In contrast, if accountability were embraced, if the wrongdoing was acknowledged and corrective steps taken, it would send a powerful message that India values integrity above pride. Accountability also involves transparency. Nations cannot afford to sweep scandals under the rug when the world is watching. In a time of instant communication, any attempt to hide the truth usually results in greater damage when the facts inevitably come to light. If one Indian were responsible for a scandal that threatened US-India relations, the wisest path forward would not be concealment, but openness. Transparency shows that a country has nothing to hide and that it is willing to confront uncomfortable truths to preserve the larger relationship. Without transparency, suspicion festers, and suspicion is the enemy of trust. Yet accountability is not only about punishment, it is also about prevention. Holding individuals responsible must go hand in hand with building systems that minimize the risk of such incidents occurring again. If a diplomat behaves arrogantly, accountability means not only recalling them, but also reforming diplomatic training to emphasize respect and humility. If a business magnate commits fraud, accountability requires not only prosecution, but also the strengthening of financial regulations to prevent similar abuses. When a government is forward-looking, it transforms moments of crisis into opportunities for growth, ensuring that the mistakes of one person do not define the legacy of an entire nation. In the case of US-India relations, accountability becomes even more important because both countries are proud democracies. Democracies thrive on the principle that no one is above the law, whether ordinary citizens or powerful leaders. If either country appears to shield individuals from accountability because of their political or diplomatic position, it undermines the credibility of democracy itself. The world watches how these nations handle crises, and their choices send messages far beyond their borders. By embracing accountability, India would not only preserve its relationship with the United States, but also demonstrate to the world that it stands firmly by the principles of fairness and justice. Accountability also has a personal dimension. Leaders and representatives must cultivate the humility to accept responsibility when they err. Too often, individuals in positions of power deflect blame, pointing fingers at others or rationalizing their behavior. This refusal to accept fault is destructive because it prolongs conflict and denies closure. When one Indian's actions jeopardize relations with the US, accountability requires that the person accept responsibility rather than hiding behind the shield of nationalism. This acceptance not only restores dignity but also prevents the situation from spiraling into a larger diplomatic confrontation. The courage to admit fault is often more powerful than denial. Moreover, accountability fosters respect. Nations may forgive mistakes, but they rarely forgive arrogance. If the United States sees that India is willing to acknowledge when one of its own has done wrong, it deepens respect for India as a mature, responsible partner. Conversely, if India refuses to hold its representative accountable, it risks being viewed as unreliable or unwilling to uphold international norms. Respect, once lost, is extremely difficult to regain. Accountability ensures that even when mistakes occur, respect between nations can be preserved. One of the most dangerous consequences of avoiding accountability is the precedent it sets. If one person is allowed to act recklessly without consequence, others may follow, believing they too will be shielded. This erodes discipline within institutions and invites repeated crises. By holding individuals accountable, India would be drawing a clear line. No one has the right to jeopardize national interests for personal arrogance or carelessness. Accountability, then, is not only about repairing the past, but also about protecting the future. Another important aspect is the message accountability sends to citizens. When people see their government act decisively against wrongdoing, they gain confidence in its integrity. When they see leaders evade responsibility, cynicism spreads. In both India and the United States, citizens are deeply aware of how their countries are perceived globally. If they feel that their leaders protect the guilty rather than defending national honor through honesty, public trust diminishes. By demonstrating accountability in moments of crisis, governments not only preserve international partnerships, but also strengthen faith at home. It must also be remembered that accountability is not weakness. Too often, governments fear that admitting fault will make them appear submissive or vulnerable. But the opposite is true. Nations that admit mistakes and correct them are seen as strong because they demonstrate confidence in their values. For the US-India relationship, this distinction is crucial. If one Indian's actions jeopardize the partnership, India's willingness to address it openly would not signal weakness, but maturity. Strength is not the absence of mistakes, it is the ability to confront them without fear. Ultimately, accountability ensures that individuals do not overshadow nations. One person may act recklessly, but through accountability, their actions can be isolated and contained, preventing them from defining the entire relationship. Accountability tells the world, this was the failure of a person, not the failure of a country. Without accountability, the line blurs and the person becomes inseparable from the nation's image. In international relations, that distinction can be the difference between repair and collapse. In this way, the lesson of accountability extends far beyond one crisis. It reminds nations that partnerships are fragile, but they can be protected if responsibility is embraced. US-India relations may one day face a test caused by a single individual. But the true measure of the relationship will not be in the mistake itself. It will be in how India responds, whether it chooses denial and defensiveness or accountability and responsibility. The future of any alliance rests not in perfection, but in the willingness to take ownership of failure and to rise stronger because of it. When relationships between nations are damaged by the actions of a single individual, the easy assumption is that the damage is permanent, that trust once broken cannot be restored. Yet history teaches us otherwise. Great partnerships have endured wars, betrayals, and countless misunderstandings, and they have survived because both sides recognized that their bond was greater than the mistakes of one person. US-India relations are no exception. Even if one Indian's actions manage to fracture trust, the path to rebuilding remains open, provided there is willingness, humility, and a vision that looks beyond the moment of crisis toward the long-term future. Rebuilding begins with perspective. One person's failure should never be allowed to define the character of over 1 billion people or the spirit of an entire nation. If an individual damages relations, the first task of both governments is to separate the person from the partnership. This means making it clear through actions and words that the mistake of one does not erase decades of cooperation, shared values, and common goals. It means refusing to let the narrative of mistrust dominate the larger story of collaboration. Without this distinction, suspicion lingers and stereotypes take root, making reconciliation harder. The path to rebuilding also requires dialogue. Silence in diplomacy is dangerous because it creates space for speculation, misinterpretation, and resentment. When an incident strains ties, both India and the United States must communicate directly and openly. High-level talks, back-channel diplomacy, and even public reassurances are necessary to remind both nations' citizens that the partnership remains valuable. Dialogue allows grievances to be aired without hostility and solutions to be crafted without the poison of public anger. More importantly, it ensures that a temporary rift does not harden into permanent division. Mutual respect must anchor the rebuilding process. When one individual's actions create insult or injury, it is easy for pride to dominate the response. Nations, much like individuals, often retreat into defensiveness, demanding respect while refusing to extend it. But true respect is reciprocal. If India expects the United States to move past the damage caused by one Indian, it must demonstrate through words and conduct that it values the US as a partner. Similarly, America must acknowledge India's importance and resist the temptation to treat one Indian as a reflection of national character. Mutual respect creates the environment in which forgiveness and forward movement become possible. Trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt with words alone. It must be earned again through consistent action. This is perhaps the hardest part of repairing US-India ties in the aftermath of a damaging incident. Both nations must commit to demonstrating reliability through deeds. If the crisis was caused by arrogance, the response must show humility. If it was caused by dishonesty, the remedy must be transparency. If it was caused by aggression, the solution must be restraint. Each step of accountability and reform signals to the other side that the relationship matters enough to be repaired. With time, such consistency can restore even the deepest wounds. The path forward also requires focusing on common interests. The US and India share far more than one dispute or one betrayal can erase. They are bound by democratic values, economic cooperation, security partnerships, and cultural ties. When an individual damages relations, it is vital for both nations to remind themselves of these shared foundations. Instead of dwelling on the injury, they must return to the areas where collaboration benefits both sides. By working together on issues like technology, defense, climate change, and trade, they reinforce the reality that the relationship is bigger than any one person or incident. Public perception is another dimension that must be managed carefully. Often when relations sour, the anger of ordinary citizens in both countries becomes a barrier to reconciliation. Media narratives fuel outrage, social platforms amplify hostility, and soon public sentiment demands retaliation rather than reconciliation. To rebuild, leaders on both sides must communicate directly to their people, explaining not only the gravity of the incident but also the necessity of moving forward. They must frame reconciliation not as weakness but as strength, reminding citizens that forgiveness and cooperation are acts of maturity. Without shaping public opinion, even the best diplomatic efforts can falter under the weight of resentment. Rebuilding also means investing in symbols of friendship. After a crisis, words and promises are not enough. Tangible gestures are needed to prove commitment. These might include joint initiatives, high-profile visits, or cooperative projects that showcase the resilience of the partnership. Such gestures demonstrate that the nations are not stuck in the past, but are actively building a future together. They also send a message to the world that neither India nor the US will allow one individual to dictate the destiny of their alliance. Another essential step is patience. Trust is not rebuilt overnight. The temptation in international relations is to demand immediate resolution, but healing takes time. Both sides must be prepared for setbacks, for moments when suspicion resurfaces or wounds are reopened. Patience allows space for gradual healing, where consistency replaces doubt and sincerity replaces cynicism. By recognizing that rebuilding is a process, not a single act, the US and India can endure the difficult phases and eventually arrive at a stronger bond. Reconciliation also requires humility on both sides. Nations are often reluctant to admit mistakes because pride and sovereignty are at stake. Yet humility is what transforms crisis into opportunity. If India acknowledges its responsibility when one of its own has caused harm, it shows maturity. If the US accepts that mistakes do not define entire nations, it shows fairness. This mutual humility breaks the cycle of blame and allows both nations to step onto the path of repair together. Humility is not weakness, it is the strength to value the relationship above the ego. It is also worth remembering that crises, when handled with wisdom, can actually deepen relationships. Paradoxically, sometimes it is in overcoming a serious setback that bonds are fortified. By confronting difficulties together, by surviving moments of mistrust, and by proving that the alliance can endure storms, both nations emerge stronger. What could have been the end of US-India relations can instead become the moment they evolved into something more resilient. The test of a partnership is not whether it avoids all mistakes, but whether it survives them. Finally, the responsibility for rebuilding lies not only with governments, but also with people. Citizens, business leaders, cultural ambassadors, and ordinary individuals play a powerful role in shaping how nations perceive one another. When political ties are strained, cultural exchange, student connections, trade relationships, and people-to-people ties can keep the bond alive until governments catch up. These connections remind both sides that no single act of betrayal defines the entirety of their relationship. The friendship between nations is not only written in treaties but also in the daily interactions of their people. In the end, the destruction of US-India relations by the actions of one Indian is not inevitable. It is only a temporary challenge if both sides recognize the larger truth. Nations are not built or broken by individuals alone. The partnership between India and the United States is far too significant to be defined by one person's error. Rebuilding requires patience, humility, accountability, and above all, the courage to look beyond a single moment of damage toward the horizon of possibility. If these principles are embraced, then what one Indian may have damaged, millions of Indians and Americans together can restore. The legacy of the partnership then will not be of destruction, but of resilience of two nations that chose to rise above the failings of one person to build a future together. Throughout history, nations have faced moments when trust was tested, when alliances seemed on the verge of collapse, and when the actions of a single individual cast a shadow over years of progress. The story of US-India relations is no different. Yes, one Indian may have shaken the foundations of this partnership, but no individual holds the power to erase the will of millions who believe in cooperation, progress, and shared destiny. The true strength of any relationship, whether between people or nations, is not measured by its ability to avoid hardship, but by its ability to survive it. The United States and India stand at a crossroads where they must decide whether to let a single misstep define their future or to rise above it with maturity, accountability, and vision. They must choose whether to see themselves as adversaries over one incident or as allies with far greater battles to fight together: poverty, inequality, terrorism, climate change, and the quest for peace. The answer lies not in dwelling on betrayal, but in recommitting to trust, not in clinging to resentment, but in forging understanding. Let the world see that no single act of arrogance, no single voice of betrayal, no single misjudgment can silence the greater truth of this alliance. Let it be known that when one individual tried to weaken the bridge between two great democracies, the people of both nations chose to build it stronger, brick by brick, with patience and purpose. And let this serve as a message to the future that the bond between India and the United States is not fragile, not temporary, and not defined by mistakes, but by resilience, renewal, and the shared vision of two free nations standing side by side. Because in the end, the legacy of this story will not be how US-India relations were destroyed by one Indian, but how they were saved, strengthened, and redefined by the courage of two nations that refused to let one person's failure become the destiny of millions. That is the power of unity, the power of resilience, and the power of vision. That is the true path forward.